Welcome, friends, to the Life in Motion podcast. I am Kyle here with my co-host, Phil Stevenson, where we take you behind the scenes of what's going on in our heads and hearts at Life Community Church. Phil, how you doing today?
I am doing fantastic. I think we're doing this on Halloween, so it's not too scary, but I think we're going to be fine.
We are doing it on Halloween. I am a little scared. I'm scared because my costume this year is scary. My 11-year-old son wanted to have matching costumes, which when your preteen wants to have a relationship with you, you soak up every minute of it because it's not going to happen very long. So we have matching costumes. We are hot dogs.
All right.
The good news is it's kind of easy to take on and off, but I'm going to be walking around like a hot dog. And I can only imagine the jokes that my neighbors are going to make because they have my sense of humor, which is not appropriate.
Absolutely. Well, we like to sit in the driveway at one of our kids, and we're going to be doing that. And I told my 10-year-old grandson, Miles, that I'm going to be dressed as a really cold person, going to have a lot of clothing on and sitting by a fire.
That's very good. Yeah. That's smart. All right, what are we talking about today?
Well, I think there's a couple of things we had kind of chatted about. But one thing that I'm interested in, and you may not want to talk about this because I know you don't like to talk about yourself, but I happen to know a couple of weeks ago you were not feeling well. You were not up to par, but yet you still showed up to church. And one thing I personally appreciate about that, one is that you showed up, but second of all, you didn't complain about having to show up. No one, I don't think, even knew that you weren't feeling the best. You're having your A game, I guess, physically. And I'm just wondering, why would you do that? Why don't you just, when you don't feel like the best, you say, well, I think I'll use this as a point to stay home, especially if there's like a good football game on or something. I'm just curious about what motivates you to show up on a regular basis to share with us.
You're right. I know this sounds hard to believe, but I don't like talking about myself. Let me tell you, the hardest thing about showing up on that day is not being able to greet people in the lobby. I like high five and hug every single person I meet. Everyone on the tech team and the band, I go and I give them a fist bump every single week. And so not doing that is weird for me, and quarantining feels weird. But I think this is going to sound weird. It would actually be more painful and difficult for me not to preach. And here's the reason why. I had a mentor who described the process of preaching a sermon like the process of giving birth, which was just A, kind of grotesque, and B, a dude should not be giving another dude a sermon about or an illustration about giving birth. Like, I just imagine every single woman who's rolled your eyes, it was justified. So just stick with me. And he said, the sermon, it kind of starts small and it's inside of you, and it grows and expands. It has different stages and forms. There's times where it feels amazing, times where it feels awkward and painful and hard to carry. But at some point, it's got to come out of you. And I think that's really what happened. When I'm preparing the sermon, it's like God has put life or put this word inside of me. And when I get it, I'm like, I want to share it because it's good news. It's helpful. Someone needs to hear this. And I'm honestly kind of afraid that if I don't preach that message that I have, I'm going to go and preach that message to everyone I see, my neighbor, my barista, my everybody. Mm-hmm. But there really is something alive inside of me that I really do hope is a blessing. Now, there's times where I feel like, man, I wasn't as good, I wasn't as sharp. But I think in those moments, there's also this other gift that God gives me. And I hope this comes across with a pure heart and not like a jerk, because it could go the wrong way. I also need the reminder that the power is not in my performance, but in God's word. It's not in how well I deliver or if I'm as precise as I want it to be. And I think that's the other thing for me. Number one, and most importantly, there's something alive that I want to share, but also it's those good reminders that it's really not about me. And, Paul says, in my weakness, he is glorified. And I think it's one of those reminders for me as a preacher that it's really not about me.
Yeah. Well, I want to tell you too personally that not being someone who doesn't like to be around sick people, ill people, whatever. I'm glad you didn't come around and greet people. I remember on that Sunday I potentially thought, I'm not going anywhere near Kyle. I'm glad he's up on that platform, and God bless him. And probably well over a year ago, I was already scheduled to preach here. And the day before, you had spoken at the men's breakfast. Mm-hmm. And so when I got to get my mic, Lori Kelly was giving me my mic and setting my mic up. And she said, I just want you to know that this is the same headset that Kyle used yesterday, and he's sick. She goes, but we sanitized it.
But
I got to tell you, I was thinking that whole time, You could have gone all day and not told me that. Because now I'm going to go home and think, I think I caught something from that microphone.
Well, you've said you've been a self-proclaimed germaphobe.
Absolutely.
Not a hypochondriac,
Yes.
but a germaphobe. So look at Justin right here. He's the one who cleaned that mic and kept you COVID-free.
I
So
like it. Yeah. I feel fine.
I have a question for you. You just recently wrote a blog. For those of you who don't know you, you've had a blog where you have a leadership lesson that goes out at least once a week for a long time. And you wrote one recently based on a conversation we had called Embrace the Awkward. I'm curious, what made you about Embrace the Awkward stuck out to you that you wanted to write about it? Or kind of what is the purpose and process behind why you've been writing this blog for so long? And now you're retired. You don't have to. Actually, you didn't have to before. So I'd love to hear about either the Embrace the Awkward post that you're writing or how and why you do this.
Well, thanks for asking about that. I've been writing at some capacity as long as I've been in ministry, and it's had different forms because things have changed how you deliver things. Now it's an e-delivered email that goes out twice a week to the people who are on that, and then I post it on Facebook and I post it on LinkedIn too. And so I just love writing. That's one of the skills I feel God gave me. And so I'm, in essence, unlike when I was in pastoral ministry where you're preaching every week, I don't preach every week, but that blog is kind of my method of communication. I have to keep it short. I feel it's no more than a 3-minute read. And so I'm always looking, quote unquote, for material. And one Sunday, and I don't remember if you were starting announcements or a sermon, you just happened to say from the platform, you paused like you were going to say something. And as you do sometimes, maybe I shouldn't say this, but then you do, which we're very happy for. But before you had this one statement, you said, well, just embrace the awkward. And all of a sudden I thought, I don't know why I love that statement. And so I just gave it some thought. So I wrote one of my blogs on Embrace the Awkward. And the awkward thing is I like to share a little bit more about what I said, but I write a lot of those ahead of time and I bank them and they just go out automatically. So sometimes I don't remember, but the best I can recall, it was the whole idea that we sometimes pull back from trying something because it may be new to us or it may make us uncomfortable because we just don't want to look awkward. And yet we do, if we're going to learn and grow and have new experience, we sometimes just have to embrace the awkward, go in knowing I'm going to be pretty awkward feeling about this, but I'm going to give it a go. And so that was the statement that you made, and I appreciate because there's lots of times that I'll hear something you say or I'll see something and I will say, I can run with that and then go back and kind of flesh it out in my own mind and on paper a little bit.
I love that even though you're the expert, I know I say that like kind of jokingly, but I mean, really you are. I mean, you've got a doctorate degree, you've written over 6 books and you're still learning and trying to absorb as much as you can. And I love that as a model. One of the people here at our church who helped me see that was one of our former congregants and staff member, Sharon Stanger, who in my world is just, perfect in every way. I know that's not really true, but as I was able to work with her, and weirdly, I was her boss. She's more than old enough to be my mom. But when she was talking about the ways that she was still growing, there was this reminder, Kyle, you never get there. And I always thought like, all right, when I'm 20, I'll be there. When I'm 30, when I'm 40, when I'm 50, And I think there's an encouragement for all of us who say, hey, we're still on this journey. And anywhere this side of heaven, we've never quite arrived.
Right. And there's always something to learn. And I've always loved the idea of the phrase lifelong learner. And so I try to keep doing that. And the experiences I have, people I meet, love to ask people lots of questions when I get together with them. So I agree. There's always, the statement's been said by other people. I can't say it's my own, but as long as you're breathing, there's something else to learn. And so I kind of try to do that the best I can in my life.
I want to hold my breath right now.
Don't do it. It's awkward silence. There you go. We've experienced it.
All right, let's not embrace the awkward. What's next, Phil? What are we talking about next?
Well, I think I would be interested to talk a little bit about your sermon recently, in fact, last Sunday, I believe. And one of the things that I was thinking about, and maybe no one else was thinking about this, and that was when you talked about being convicted or being condemned. And it hit me that how often, it seems to me anyway, that we, and I put myself in that camp as well, will have a tendency to kind of resist the conviction, but embrace the condemnation.
Wow.
And why do you think that is?
It's such a good question. Why do we reject conviction and accept the condemnation? My most succinct way I can say that is this, is condemnation is stickier. Condemnation is easier to get stuck in. That's actually the point of condemnation, is to stay into this judged, I'm bad state. And even when we condemn others, right, we're trying to label them and write them off. And so I think that's the thing. Condemnation is like quicksand. It's made to get stuck. And the more we struggle with it, the more we're going to sink. Versus conviction actually leads us forward. And you actually don't get stuck in it. It's a process that you move through. And the majority of the time, I see people walking through that process and not getting stuck in conviction, because it's being led by the Holy Spirit. It's led by God, and it leads to somewhere better. And it's just not made for being stuck in. So I just think it's the nature of what it is, more so than our psychology. I just think it's the nature of the power of condemnation, which brings death, and conviction that brings life. And no one ever asks, hey, why do you think, babies are born? It's kind of what they do. Yeah. And that's how I feel about conviction. It brings life.
Now, along that same line, do you think conviction could be kind of a way the Spirit of God, as we walk in the Lord, guides us and protects us, but also gives us freedom? Because if we have areas of conviction, we have so much freedom as we walk in that conviction and allow God to help us overcome the things that we're being convicted of. And then there seems like there's just this freedom that we might live in.
It's funny you say this, because you said something earlier and I was going to comment on it, and I was like, I don't need to comment on everything, but now we're going back to it, so I will. You talked about how you write a weekly blog. Old Kyle, living out of condemnation, would say, I really should do that too. That's a great idea. I could email, I could write, I should, and I should on myself. That's the thing that condemnation does. But I think the conviction allows me to say, Kyle, that's not who you are. You're not a good writer. One time, I got feedback on my paper saying, of all the students in all of my classes, this is the worst written one ever. I was like, thank you so much. That was so helpful. And I'm like, can you help me? He's like, I don't know, let's try. I'm like, what do you want me to do here? But again, writing's not my thing. And I think that's where the conviction comes from. Conviction does bring freedom, because conviction says you're stuck in that thing and I can set you free. Or conviction could be in this thing. That's just not who I am, and that's okay.
Absolutely. And to live in the way God has made us. And then sometimes I think condemnation comes just from our own inability to live in our self-esteem that God has given to us as a child of God.
Yep.
And so we buy into, frankly, some misunderstandings of people telling us what you mentioned, what we should do. This is what you should do. All Christians should do this. And it may not necessarily be that.
Yeah. It's interesting you talk about getting stuck, even knowing what you should do. One of the things I cut from my sermon a few weeks ago, that I was one of those, do you cut it? Do you keep it? But in chapter 7 of Romans, I ended up focusing on the struggle of transformation and why it's so hard, why we often get stuck. But this thing that I cut, Paul is very much interested in what is the relationship to the law, because you have Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. And so one of the things they're wrestling with is what is the role of the law in it? And he says this interesting thing. He says that evil seizing the opportunity created by the law. And I'm like, whoa. Seizing the opportunity. It's almost as though evil used the law to pounce. Like something in the law gave people an opportunity, which doesn't make sense, because the law was a gift from God. And if we think otherwise, we actually don't understand the heart of God nor the scriptures. How was it that this thing that's a gift from God created an opportunity? And one of the things it reminds me of is in Paul's journey, Paul says, he was the Pharisee of Pharisees. The Pharisees are the ones who are set apart, the best at following the rules. And it's interesting that this guy who's saying, I was the best at following the rules, and that actually became an Achilles heel for me. And I think it says something about the enemy. What the enemy will do is take a gift from God and try and twist it and make it your downfall. So again, for example, For Paul, he's so good at following the law. It becomes his downfall because one, he gets self-righteous, and B, he realizes he can never do it. I think about so many other things. I think of folks who are phenomenal organizers. Sometimes they become so obsessed with organization, it can lead to anxiety if we allow it to. Again, that's not how God's created us. God's created you to organize. I even think of, something like sex. Sex is a gift from God. And I think what the evil one wants to do is say, how do I pervert this? How do I take this good gift of God and twist it around and use it for evil? And so I think I want to say that to our folks who are out there. I think I'd love for you to take a moment and just name, if you'd have the courage to say, these are the gifts, these are the strengths, these are the opportunities God's given me. Here are the skills or the finances. And that's a gift from God. And just be aware that the devil will try and use this against me at some point, but I'm not going to let him because it doesn't belong to him and it doesn't belong to me. If it belongs to God, at that point, it's almost impossible for the devil to use it. If that gift or skill belongs to me, when it's in my hands, the devil can easily pervert it. But when it's in God's hand, God's like, can't touch this.
Exactly. That's good. That's good insight. Yeah.
I love it. All right, speaking of insights, I got a question for you. So actually multiple people asked this and asked in different ways. So I'm going to start by asking it short and maybe we can have some conversation, unpack it. It was interesting. There was multiple folks, but one was an older gentleman in our church who I think we'd all look at as like, wow, devoted follower of Jesus for many, many years. He says, I'm struggling to trust God. And he went on to tell me a story that doesn't need to be shared here. And he said, could you guys talk about it? And I'm like, I love asking Dr. Phil questions. So Dr. Phil, how do we learn to trust God?
I think that the ability to trust God is no different than any other trusting relationship. Trust, as they'll say, it's very difficult to get, but it's easy sometimes to compromise. And then once it is, it's difficult to retain. So I think it's about our relationship with God as we build that relationship with God and learning to release whatever it is that we're unwilling to trust Him with. And if we don't feel that God has our best interest in mind, just like in any relationship, marriage relationship, Joni and I are going on, hard to believe, but almost 50 years of marriage. And in that time frame, I look back and think, oh my goodness, the things we've gone through and the things we had to learn to trust each other in, to discover our abilities and strengths in that we trust, what I trust Joni with her area of strength in our marriage and she trusts me with. It just takes time and it's forever. It's going to go on forever until one of us goes to heaven. And I don't want to be first, but anyway. and so I think it's the same thing with God. Is that we walk with Him, and then in each situation there's a new learning to trust Him in that, because, and you don't want to use this just. I'm trying to explain it without trying to just make it flippant.
Yeah.
But it is just a dynamic of a constant growing relationship with God. And at first you may not want to trust Him with something, and He's going to be patient until we get to a point, well, I'm going to be willing to trust Him and see what He will do. If I can go way back and share a very quick illustration. And when Joni and I were early on in our marriage, I was in school, I was working part-time, she was working full-time, we had no kids, and things were tight. We lived down in San Diego, and so we had this situation. We came up and we got asked, and I'm not even sure looking back how it happened, we got asked to be house parents for two Chinese young men. One was in high school, one was in college. They were there in San Diego going to school. Their parents had means, if I say that, they worked in Hong Kong. And so we ended up being house parents. The home was owned by the parents, and it was a 5-bedroom home. It was, and it had a pool, all these things. And all we had to do was pay half the utilities, and then we had to pay of course, pay for our food and that whole thing. But we were there to kind of guide them and give some help. And again, as I share this, I'm not talking about prosperity gospel. I'm talking about what God reminded me of. So I'm in this room, and since there's 5 bedrooms, I actually have my own office area, which was unusual. I was going to school full-time at that time, working part-time. And I was writing out, now I know some of you don't know what a check is, but I was writing out a check. It's a piece of paper, you write a number on it, it actually cashes, and people can use it as money.
It's like Venmo.
Venmo, but hard copy.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting there in this office. I just written out this tithe check, and things are still tight. And I'm saying, and I literally can remember to this day holding it up to the sky and saying, God, this bitter work, you tithe, whatever. And as I was doing that, it wasn't right at that moment, but several years later, God brought that thought back to me, and I realized, dude, you're sitting you're not paying rent. You've got 5 bedrooms. You got a pool. What do you mean? Is it going to? Of course it works. You trusted me with your finances, and this is what I'm providing. And so to me, that was the trusting aspect of that. I've been walking with the Lord for a while. I believed in tithing in that situation, but it was still that opportunity to take a trust step in that area as a young married guy, and then for God to remind me, hey, it works. I take care of you.
I love the analogy between trusting God and trusting your spouse. Again, you've been married for 50 years, and when you married her, you trusted her, but now you've learned how to trust her more. Mm-hmm. And I hope the same is true, that we learn how to trust God, but it takes time, mm-hmm. It takes trial, it takes testing, it takes going out when you're not sure. Like you talk about writing that check, is that what you call it?
I call that check, a piece of paper.
And even like I'm not sure, but trying it and testing him, I do think makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of the same one who said I was a horrible writer. He was an Old Testament professor. He said this. He said the Hebrew view of time is walking backwards into the future. Mm-hmm. And he did it. He walked backwards, and he had this thing like, I don't know what's in front of me, but I know what's behind me, and all I see behind me is the faithfulness of God, and it's what's behind me in God's faithfulness that makes me trust that He'll be faithful in the future. So continuing to remember, and I think there's something there about remembering. I had a conversation with someone recently who's just going through a really hard thing, and she reminded me about a few weeks ago we had a thing where we encouraged people to remember a time that God had done a miracle, and they wrote it on a rock, and she's like, that rock has been more powerful in the last 2 weeks than you could ever know. Mm-hmm. So I think there is that walking backwards into the future, the time thing. I also think it's like trust with anyone else, that it's easy to break. And here's my warning to folks is, one of the things that breaks trust is missed expectations, mm-hmm. right? You come home and you think your spouse has made dinner and you're expecting it to be there and it's not, and you're upset. Mm-hmm. Versus if you weren't expecting it and it's not there, you're not upset. And that's a simple illustration. And I think that's one of the things that unfortunately I think becomes a trust buster between us and God. We have an expectation that He's going to do something. Give me the relationship, the job, answer the healing prayer for cancer, or those things. And when God doesn't, it's missed expectations. And that's one of the things that's hard for us to do. And instead of bringing that frustration and that mixed expectation for God, I think what we think it's more spiritual to sweep it under the rug and say, oh, God, I still trust you. And I think that's what happens with some, like you use the thing about marriage. Mm-hmm. Sometimes when there's issues in the marriage and you don't address those things that have broken trust, they kind of leave cracks there that you come and trip on later. And so I think that'd be my encouragement. Just like you said, again, it's like a relationship. It takes time and trial, but also when there's things that break trust, you've got to have a moment to stop and slow down and say, we've got to rebuild this relationship, because one day something bigger will be built on it. And if we don't have the foundation, it's going to crack when we try and add the second and third story to the home.
Right. And to use that marriage relationship again as an example, years ago when Joni and I were leading a young couples class, I brought in a panel. I had, at that time, everybody in that class were under 10 years of marriage. So I brought in a couple for a panel. One had been married for 10, one had been married for 25, I think, another one for 35 or 40, and then we had someone married 50 years. And the thing that I remember most, and it was all of them to share, but it was really question and answer. And I can remember one thing that came out in that entire thing, and that was this. Every single one of those couples said there was a time in their marriage where they wanted to be done. They wanted to quit. And they said, but we didn't. And that continued to build our trust relationship with each other. And so sometimes in those times you feel like God's not present there, just remember, don't quit. Don't step away. Just know that's going to come through, and there's going to be worth it to hang in there in your relationship with God and continue to trust for whatever is going to become next.
Yeah, it reminds me where scriptures talk about, count it all joy for the suffering that you have. James has a statement like it. Paul has one similar in Romans, and it talks about, how the struggles create trials, the trials create perseverance, the perseverance creates hope, and that's kind of what builds that trust. It is the hard times with God that maybe impact our faith even more than the good times with God.
Right. Exactly.
That's very good. Dr. Phil, thank you so much for coming through again. I love the wisdom there. I love doing this with you. Friends, thank you so much for listening to the Life in Motion podcast. I love you. I love being your pastor. If you have any questions or suggestions, please email us podcast@lifecconline.com. podcast@lifecconline.com. We would love your questions, suggestions, and feedback. Love you. See you soon.